Chapter 14, the Digestive System and Nutrition, Screencast 1. Now, this particular chapter is focusing on two things. The first thing we'll talk about is the digestive system, and you're going to hear the digestive system referred to in a number of different ways. You may hear GI tract, gastrointestinal tract, alimentary canal, alimentary system. All of those are other names that are used to describe the digestive system. This chapter also focuses a little bit on nutrition and some health issues that we are facing within this country. Now, the digestive system is divided into two subdivisions. Those are going to be the GI tract and the accessory organs. One thing I want us to remember, the digestive system, as far as the GI tract goes, is actually completely open to the external environment. So anything in the tube or the lumen of the tube is not inside your body. It's not until it crosses the epithelial layer that's lining the tube or is absorbed where it actually moves into your body. So that's an important thing to keep in mind. Now, lumen, that's a term that we've talked about before, and that's actually the hollow part. Okay, so that's the hollow part of the space within the tube. And if we look at the structures that are part of this tube, it includes the mouth, the pharynx, esophagus, stomach, small intestine, large intestine, rectum, and anus. Now, accessory organs, now this is the other part. They are actually producing secretions into the tube. So these are going to be made up of the salivary glands, the liver, gallbladder, and pancreas. Now, we can see that here. And so what we have on the right panel are all the organs and some descriptions of those and some general introduction. I'm not going to go through that right now. And then on the left, those are the accessory organs. So the salivary glands, the liver, pancreas, and appendix. So all of those are considered to be accessory organs. And note, they are not part of the tube. That's really important. Now, another really important thing about the GI tract is it has 4 layers, or you may see the term tunics. And these are common layers throughout the system, but one thing I want to kind of take note here is the mucosa, which is the innermost layer, that's going to change. So we will encounter different types of tissue that makes up the mucosa. Now, this is really important. Now, remember, the mucosa is in contact with the lumen. So whatever is in the tube is in contact with the mucosa. So whatever type of tissue the mucosa is, that kind of determines what's happening there. And I'll point that out a little bit later. Submucosa, that is a layer of connective tissue. And what we'll find there are blood vessels, lymph vessels, and nerves. Then we have the muscularis. This is the smooth muscle component. And depending upon where you are, there's 2 or 3 layers. And what we'll notice here is that smooth muscle is responsible for movement, and you may be familiar with the term gastric motility. So motility is another term that you'll hear. The outermost layer is the serosa. So you should be able to list from innermost to outermost the 4 layers. So mucosa, submucosa, muscularis, and serosa. Now, along the way, we're going to see sphincters. And what sphincters are, there's these thick muscular rings, and they're separating some of the organs from each other. Here we can see the layers. So there's the lumen. Okay, there's the mucosa. The submucosa, so we can see here nerves, vessels, and lymphatics. Green is the color typically used to indicate lymphatics. Yellow is the color used to indicate nerves. Here we can see 2 layers, okay, of the muscle for the most part. Generally what you'll see is a circular layer and a longitudinal layer. And note the circular layer is innermost, and then we've got the longitudinal layer. And then we have that outermost, which is the serosa. And that's just actually connective tissue. And what that does, it's basically protecting and acts as an anchor for the digestive tract. Now, there's 5 general functions or processes that make up digestion. The first is mechanical processing and movement. So examples of this are going to be chewing and mixing. And we'll talk about the different types of movement that occur. Then there's a number of secretions that are produced. They're fluid in nature. They could be digestive enzymes and hormones. Other examples of secretions are bile, which comes from the liver, acid we'll find in the stomach, alkali, so we have to neutralize the acid, and mucus is very common. Now, the third function is digestion, and this basically consists of two parts, a mechanical process such as chewing, and then chemical or digestive. So really what we're talking about here is taking these larger things and breaking them down into smaller things. We have absorption, so the body cannot access any of the nutrients unless they're actually absorbed. So this is through the mucosa, and then after they're absorbed, nutrients and water will move into the blood or lymph vessels, fat especially. And then we have elimination, and that's basically what's left over we get rid of. So anything that's undigested will be eliminated as feces. Now here, there's two basic types of movement or motility that we're going to see. One is peristalsis, and this is actually movement through, and we can kind of see that here. So when this smooth muscle contracts, what it's actually doing is moving food through the GI tract. Then there's segmentation, and this is actually mixing. So remember, there's a lot of fluids and secretions here, and mixing, just kind of imagine when you're mixing cookie dough or something like that, you're trying to basically get a good mixture and make sure that everything is kind of exposed and so on. So those are the two main motility movements that we see, peristalsis and segmentation. Next, what we're going to do is kind of work our way through the first part of the digestive system. Now, when we look at the mouth, basically what we see here is mechanical digestion, but there also is some chemical digestion. So if we look at the teeth, basically that's responsible for the biting and chewing of food. And the tongue plays an important role also, that skeletal muscle. And what it's going to do is going to position and move food around. Previously, in the sensory nervous system, we talked about the taste receptors or taste buds, which are located on the tongue. And then also the tongue plays an important role for speech, making sure that certain sounds are produced correctly. Saliva, that is going to be secreted by the salivary glands, and there's three of them. We have the parotids, which are the largest, submandibular under the jaw, and then sublingual under the tongue. Now, saliva is a mixture of different things. Mucin, okay, salivary amylase, that's the enzyme responsible for breaking down starch. There's going to be bicarbonate, this actually acts as a buffer, and it's going to maintain the pH between 6.5 and a 7.5, and that's basically the optimal pH for the activity of amylase. Also, there's going to be lysozymes, and what those are, they're responsible for inhibiting bacterial growth, because remember, we're now looking at an entryway into the body, and that's how most pathogens and foreign substances are going to get into our body. Now, the pharynx and esophagus, those are two structures that are responsible for delivering food to the stomach. Previously, we saw that the pharynx also makes up part of the respiratory tract. Now, when we look at swallowing, we'll take a look at this reflex. So there's various parts. Some are actually voluntary, and this is the part where the tongue pushes the bolus, and that's what we call the masticated contents. So after they've been chewed, basically they form a bolus, and that gets moved into the pharynx or the throat. Then there's an actual involuntary phase, and that's where we're going to see the swallowing reflex, and we'll see that just a second. Now the pharynx, as noted, that is shared with the respiratory tract. Now the epiglottis, what that does, that basically actually closes the airway temporarily so food will not enter the trachea. Then we're going to see food move through the esophagus, and that's going to be with the help of peristaltic contractions. And then food is going to move through the lower esophageal sphincter and into the stomach. Here we can basically see the steps that kind of make up the swallowing reflex. So swallowing begins, and the tongue is actually pushing the bolus into the pharynx. Now, before swallowing, muscles are keeping the esophagus closed. Now, the soft palate will actually rise, and that's going to close the passage to the nasal cavity. The uvula, that's another part, okay, that does that. And then the epiglottis bends to close off the trachea and open the esophagus. So that's going to make sure that food moves into the esophagus and not into the airway. So together, these are the steps that we see that actually make up the swallowing reflex.